Water is warm. It always depends on the temperature of the body of water that the tropical system gets into, and the Gulf of Mexico is hot out there, above 83 degrees. The storm still is over Georgia, though, so that's going to be the rub. It gets into the Gulf of Mexico, and it's going to take some time to develop. This weather is brought to you by Zyzol. All night, all day, allergy relief. Does it get there? Yes. Hot air is there. To the northeast today, it's going to be a dry day, but to the southeast, you can see the air. It's muggy, it's hot, it's humid. And the computer model is taking this into the Gulf of Mexico, the European model taking it very close to Lafayette, Louisiana, where the GFS, the American model, is closer to Houston, Texas. A lot of rainfall with this. Whether it develops into a Category 1, 2, or anything at all, it's going to be a rainfall event. Much of this rainfall could be in the 10 to 20-inch rainfall range. The American model says somewhere in New Orleans close to 10. But the European model with this white right there, John, over Lafayette, over New Iberia, that's 20 inches of rain or more. I know they get that down there, but in 24 or 48 hours, that's still a flood event. We'll keep watching.
Someone's getting very wet. We're going to keep a close eye on this, Chad. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
A major Trump donor able to bypass environmental hurdles after a secret meeting with a member of the administration. What a CNN investigation has uncovered, Arizona desert was put on hold because of environmental concerns. Then came a secret meeting between the developer and the man Donald Trump would appoint to run the Department of Interior, and suddenly the project was back on track. It has been halted again by a lawsuit, but the chairman of the House Committee on National Resources is opening an investigation into all of this. And critics say it is just the latest example of how industry leaders with connections to the Trump administration are able to get their projects pushed through. CNN senior investigative correspondent Drew Griffin has been digging on all of this. He joins us now. Drew, lay it out for us.
John, this is another example of why elections matter and how those political access points in Washington, D.C. can even help in the middle of an Arizona desert.
The Villages at Vigneto is a massive housing development being planned in this Arizona desert east of Tucson. But like all development in Arizona, water is an issue, especially for wildlife. And U.S. Fish and Wildlife Supervisor Steve Spangle thought before putting in all those homes, golf courses, and potentially 70,000 people, government scientists should look carefully at how the project would impact the nearby San Pedro River.
We wanted them to assess how much water was going to be withdrawn from the aquifer.
The EPA had said years earlier that developing the site represented a substantial and unacceptable impact, though the Army Corps of Engineers approved a permit for an earlier project on the site. Spangle decided before the new Villages at Vigneto could move forward, a full-scale biological assessment was needed. That was October 2016. Then this happened. What followed was a series of events pieced together by CNN that shows a developer with connections to the Trump administration was able to push his project forward despite environmental concerns. It was just 7 months into the new administration, Steve Spangle received an unusual phone call.
It was one of our solicitors, one of our attorneys from Washington, and she told me that she had gotten a call from a high-level political appointee within the Department of the Interior, who informed her that our position out here in Arizona was not the position of the administration.
Spangle says the lawyer from the Interior Department told him he needed to reverse his earlier decision on that environmental assessment for the project.
I felt I had a duty. I work for the administration. I have to do what I'm told, and so I did. I felt pressured to reverse my decision. In its simplest terms, I was rolled.
Spangle followed orders, reversed his decision, and 4 months later retired. Environmentalists are livid.
We're supposed to work under the laws and science was overridden here.
This is the developer. Mike Ingram is part owner of the Arizona Diamondbacks. He donated more than $50,000 to Donald Trump's political committees, co-chaired a canceled inauguration fundraiser that promised $500,000 donors a hunting trip with Donald Trump Jr. and Eric Trump and a private reception with the president. He's connected to Interior Secretary David Bernhardt, too. Ingram is a director of the Safari Club International Foundation, a group Bernhardt once represented. And since Donald Trump became president, Ingram has enjoyed easy access to Trump administration decision makers who oversee his interests. Schedules obtained by CNN show at least 11 meetings, phone calls, or emails with top Trump administration officials, including then EPA Chief Scott Pruitt and Ryan Zinke, who was Secretary of the Interior. And CNN has learned that in August of 2017, Mike Ingram met up with his old lobbyist friend and then Deputy Interior Secretary David Bernhardt, the first of at least 5 meetings with him. This secret meeting, not on any public calendar, was a private breakfast held at Mike Ingram's hunting lodge in Montana. Just 2 weeks later, Fish and Wildlife Supervisor Steve Spangle got that unusual call from Washington, and the villages at Vigneto development was on track again. A lawsuit by environmentalists filed earlier this year now has the project on hold. Ingram will not talk to CNN. He has hired one of Washington's most powerful lawyers to speak on his behalf, Lanny Davis, a Democrat.
The innuendo is, well, he's close to Trump. There must have been political influence. That's just innuendo. I can't see any evidence that there was any influence whatsoever politically. Not
this
even.
Guy has unprecedented access to David Bernhardt on August 18th, 2017. He invites him for breakfast, isn't that right?
So, yes, that's right.
At his hunting lodge?
At his hunting lodge.
And it's shortly after that that the phone call is made to Mr. Spangle telling him, we want you to change your decision.
And you've now done an incomplete narrative of the facts, so let's do the rest of the facts.
Please.
He explains the Army Corps of Engineers asked about Spangle's complaint. The Fish and Wildlife Service looked into it and found no evidence Spangle's reversal was unjustified. And it's all in a new official letter handed to CNN by Lanny Davis just days after CNN first reached out to Ingram for comment on this story.
CNN calls, and suddenly there's a brand new letter that comes out and reaffirms that everything is okay. And by the way, in that letter, nobody from Washington had anything to do with this. I mean, Mr. Davis, with all due respect, that sounds like a pretty slick move.
So if you're discussing innuendo and fog, I completely agree. If you focus on facts, the facts are that the Army Corps of Engineers made a decision on the facts under the law.
Did you have anything to do with that letter?
No.
Did Mr. Ingram have anything to do with that letter?
No, I would say on camera that sometimes bad luck happens to me when I'm working for a client. In this case, it was just pure luck that I read this letter just before the CNN interview, and I said, there is a God in heaven.
So, Drew, at a basic level, is this a case of favors being granted by the Interior Department to Secretary Bernhardt's industry friends?
You know, John, we've asked, of course, the Interior Department for answers on this, and Bernhardt himself, he's blown us off before. We just got a one-sentence response saying Fish and Wildlife looked at this, everything is okay, nothing to see here. They can get away with that, telling us that, but as you mentioned, Congress is now very much interested in this. The House Natural Resources Committee is opening an investigation, looking at all these ties between Ingram, the development, and how this all took place. So I think there is going to be some investigation to find out if indeed this is another favor being granted.
I got to say, Drew, it's the case of your digging making a difference here. You can see it while you watch Lanny Davis squirm there a little bit. Thanks so much for being with us, Drew.
All right, there's mounting pressure on the Trump White House over one of their cabinet members' ties to Jeffrey Epstein. What's going to happen today? New Day continues right now.
The biggest surprise was the debate. Kamala was a bit of a surprise.
Joe Biden thinks out loud. Some of those thoughts you want to say, keep them to yourself.
Elizabeth Warren, can she raise the money? Yes, $19.1 million.
You really can build a grassroots movement.
Trump's still pushing his administration to force a citizenship question onto the 2020 census.
I think it does provide a pathway for getting the question on the census.
This is about make America white again.
We announced the unsealing of sex trafficking charges against Jeffrey Epstein.
They found a vast trove of lewd photos.
A serious offense and a serious unit to prosecute this.
This is New Day with Allison Camerata and John Berman.
Welcome to our viewers in the United States and all around the world. This is New Day, and breaking overnight, new high-level calls for the resignation of Labor Secretary Alexandria Acosta. This is just the latest fallout from a sex trafficking case with ripple effects all over the government. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is calling on Secretary Acosta to step down for brokering a secret plea deal back in 2008 for accused sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. Acosta was a U.S. attorney in Florida at the time. Speaker Pelosi calls that deal unconscionable, and the controversy is rising again after federal prosecutors in New York implicitly rebuked Acosta's handling of the case, filing new charges yesterday accusing Epstein of running a sex trafficking ring. They allege the millionaire financier sexually abused dozens of young girls in his homes between 2002 and 2005.
They also say they uncovered a trove of lewd photos of young women in Epstein's safe last weekend. He now faces 45 years in prison. Jeffrey Epstein's social circle involves a wide swath of powerful people, including 2 U.S. presidents and a Saudi prince. We are also learning that Attorney General Bill Barr has recused himself from parts of this case because of his professional and family connections to Epstein. At this hour, we are waiting to hear from Secretary Acosta and from the White House. CNN's Bryn Gingras is here with all of the latest developments, and there are many. Bryn.
Oh, yeah. Jeffrey Epstein, an already registered sex offender, meaning this was no secret, but he still had friends in high places. Former President Clinton, President Trump, who in a 2002 interview called Epstein a terrific guy. Both have somewhat tried to distance themselves now, while Epstein is behind bars waiting a bail hearing next week. But it may be harder for others, like Acosta, to distance himself from his past connections to the multimillionaire. Growing calls this morning for President Trump's Labor Secretary Alexandria Acosta to step down over his handling of sex abuse allegations against multimillionaire Jeffrey Epstein when Acosta was the U.S. Attorney for Florida's Southern District a decade ago. A newly unsealed indictment charges the hedge fund manager with operating a sex trafficking ring where he is accused of sexually abusing dozens of underage girls in his New York City home. Epstein pleaded not guilty to all charges Monday.
As alleged, Epstein was well aware that many of his victims were minors. And not surprisingly, many of the underage girls that Epstein allegedly victimized were particularly vulnerable to exploitation.
According to the New York indictment, Epstein ran a trafficking enterprise between 2002 and 2005. The 66-year-old allegedly paid hundreds of dollars in cash to girls as young as 14 years old to have sex with him at his homes in New York and Palm Beach, Florida. Prosecutors say a search warrant executed on his Manhattan townhouse uncovered a vast trove of lewd photographs of young-looking women or girls. The indictment is a direct rebuke of a secret non-prosecution agreement Acosta negotiated with Epstein's high-powered attorneys in 2008, which suspended a federal grand jury investigation into the allegations against him. In exchange, Epstein pleaded guilty to 2 state prostitution charges. The Miami Herald called it a deal of a lifetime, considering it was a federal investigation identifying 36 underage victims. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is now calling for Acosta's resignation, saying that deal was unconscionable. Attorney General William Barr recused himself from that investigation, but now the Justice Department is looking at whether he needs to recuse himself from any other investigation into the case.
I'm recused from that matter because one of the law firms that represented Epstein long ago was a firm that I subsequently joined for a period of time.
Prosecutors calling for other women to step forward.
The alleged behavior shocks the conscience. They deserve their day in court, and we are proud to be standing up for them by bringing this indictment.
Now, we're still waiting word from the White House, but a senior administration official told CNN there was an internal review of Acosta's involvement in Epstein's case, but stopped short of commenting on his standing in the administration. In the meantime, the U.S. Attorney's Office says it's received calls from more potential victims in this case. John Nelson.
All right, Bryn Gingras, thanks very much. Again, we have yet to hear from Secretary Acosta this morning on these new calls for him to resign. We have yet to really hear from the White House about all of this. There are no public briefings. That does play into it. Joining us now is Joe Lockhart, former Clinton White House press secretary, David Gregory, CNN political analyst. And Bianca Goladriga, a CNN contributor. David Gregory, Secretary Acosta, these new calls for him to resign. The White House hasn't said much about this. There's some reporting in the Washington Post and Politico which say really the next 72 hours could be critical. And Politico has a quote here: the way to stay in this administration is to stay under the radar, out of the news, and be quiet. The president won't like it if all of these questions about Acosta and his connections to the Epstein case, if they linger. How do you see this playing out, David?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest factor. That's where we've seen the president move, is if there's a distraction that's sizable enough that overshadows him or is just shiny enough that he doesn't like it. On the other hand, Acosta could be defiant, could defend the deal as a legal matter based on facts he knew at the time or based on other circumstances, and that might please the president as well. I think it's kind of hard to call that one. The obvious point to make, I think, is that this is such bad publicity, such a distraction that the president wouldn't like it.
Joe, do you think that Acosta should have been questioned in a more robust way during his confirmation process? Senator Tim Kaine did ask him about this plea deal, but that was basically it. So should this have all come out before?
Yeah, I mean, obviously now with hindsight, it should have. I think, Senator Kaine did raise it. This story has been around for a long time. I don't think we know all of the details. Remember, it's not the Justice Department that moved this story forward. It was investigative journalism. The Miami Herald did amazing work on this by finding women, talking to them, and reporting it. And I think that gave the nudge to DOJ and SDNY to actually do this work. But yes, this should have been fully vetted by the Senate when he was nominated.
Listen to what then Secretary nominee Acosta said about this when pressed by Tim Kaine.
Based on the evidence, professionals within a prosecutor's office decide that a plea that guarantees that someone goes to jail, that guarantees that someone register generally, and that guarantees other outcomes is a good thing.
Again, he was in a Palm Beach County lockup, released.
He had work release for 6 days a week to go to his office, and he said, and other things. I mean, that was hardly a robust defense of what he had done there.
And again, Bianca, when you see this today, it is at so many different levels, because there are the legal questions about what happened 10 years ago. There's the question about why the case is being reopened or re-prosecuted now to an extent. And then there are the connections that Epstein seems to have with everybody, right? With Bill Clinton. There's this new statement from Bill Clinton out overnight. Let me read that. President Clinton knows nothing about the terrible crimes Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty to in Florida some years ago, or those with which he has been recently charged in New York. In 2002 and 2003, President Clinton took a total of 4 trips on Jeffrey Epstein's airplane, 1 to Europe, 1 to Asia, 2 to Africa, which included stops in connection with the work of the Clinton Foundation. The fact that he felt the need to make a statement, interesting in and of itself, because he knows the connections may not look good. Number 2, the wording of this statement also in question. He took 4 trips, but people say there were many more flights involved within those trips. And this is just the tip of it in terms of who Epstein was running around with.
Right. I think the core of this is that he ran in circles of powerful people, regardless of their party affiliation. I thought it was interesting to see the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York really take a swipe at Secretary Acosta and how Florida handled the case years ago as well. Secretary Acosta thus far has been very defensive with regards to how he handled the case then, said that he dealt with it, in his view, appropriately. But it is interesting to see the connections not only to Bill Clinton, but obviously to President Trump as well, and the quotes that we've seen President Trump give about Jeffrey Epstein, supporting him and being a friend and saying that he's attracted to women too.
I have it. Women. I mean, I think it's important to read it. This is from 2002. This was an interview that Donald Trump, obviously before he was president, gave to New York Magazine. He says, "I've known Jeff for 15 years. Terrific guy. He has a lot of fun. He's a lot of fun to be with. It's even said he likes beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. No doubt about it, Jeffrey enjoys his social life."
I mean, who says that? I'm just thinking back to a quote that the president gave alongside his daughter Ivanka, where she jokingly said, "The one rule I had with my father is that he couldn't date women and my friends that were, younger than me." And not wanting to compare any of the president's girlfriends with what Jeffrey Epstein's being accused of, but just to even say comments like that, it just shows that there's a huge cultural shift between what was acceptable even a few years ago to where we are now in the post-Me Too movement.
And again, David Gregory, William Barr's had to recuse himself from this because of the Kirkland Ellis ties to the defense of Jeffrey Epstein. William Barr's
a law firm that they both worked at.
Yep.
But not at the same time.
Not at the same time. William Barr's father was the headmaster of the school which hired Jeffrey Epstein in the 1970s. No connection necessarily, but just the tentacles of this case in this administration and past administrations seem to be everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the tie to the law firm, the fact that a big law firm, a big litigation firm would cause a recusal is not something that should raise eyebrows. But there's no question that this was a guy who was incredibly wealthy, who had connections to power, who used those connections, who's certainly going to use them in the course of his defense as well, who's hired a very prominent defense lawyer now in Reed Weingarten, who's defended prominent, among many other people, prominent Clinton administration folks. So, again, this is a guy who traveled in very powerful circles. It's not surprising that the tentacles would reach this far.
Hey, Joe, about the Bill Clinton stuff, I do want to ask you, because sources in the current White House have shared why this is also uncomfortable. Here's what the Washington Post reports today. Officials at the White House are nervous that Democrats will encourage women allegedly abused by Epstein to testify publicly before Congress, drawing attention to Acosta's work on the plea deal, according to current and former administration officials. And what our point was last hour was that Democrats can't be sanguine about this either because of the Bill Clinton friendship with Jeffrey Epstein and who knows who else. So this is why all of this really ugly stuff, many people we would imagine are biting their nails this morning.
Well, listen, all of this stuff should come out. On the Clinton matter, I stay in touch with the foundation, and I know, to clear up the trips versus the flights. I think the number was 26 or 27. Each of these trips, and I've been on many of these trips where you go to Asia or you go to Africa, and each flight is counted. So each trip will be 6 or 7 different flights. I know most of the Clinton circle. Jeffrey Epstein's not part of it. I've never met the guy. I've met most of the president's friends. But all of this should come out. The New York DA, Cy Vance, he should answer questions about why he wasn't registered as what they call a level 3 sexual offender. The really striking thing for me, though, with this administration is there's no discussion at all about the underlying behavior. There's no one questions Alex Acosta's judgment in letting this guy go through. It's all about, well, will this look bad on the president? And I don't think someone like Acosta would ever have been nominated by another president if they'd done vetting, but certainly wouldn't have lasted this long. I mean, the Miami Herald story has been out for months and months, and it hasn't bothered them. So that says something about their character.
Miami Herald, by the way, has called on Acosta to resign this morning in an editorial overnight. Some other big news, campaign news, Bianna. Elizabeth Warren raised $19 million in the second fundraising quarter of the year, which is a lot of money. Mm-hmm. It's more than many candidates, including Bernie Sanders. And she did it even though she wouldn't do closed-door fundraisers with big donors. What does this show you?
She did this very strategically. Early on, people were complimenting her ability to come up with finite details, right, specific plans, and yet you didn't see her numbers rising, wondering why is that? Well, now we're seeing that the real effect, the net effect of her strategic plan of going forward, not taking money from corporate donors, going for individual donors, and specifying that I'm going to enter this race with policies, with plans, with ideas, and that's clearly eclipsing Bernie Sanders.
David Gregory, what do you see in her numbers and the lane that she and Bernie Sanders share that's getting crowded?
Yeah, I mean, I just see energy. I think that Right now, the Democratic electorate is really shopping around and looking. I think there's a definite, wing of that electorate that wants to take it to Trump, wants to see somebody who can beat Trump, but they also want to refashion the party and find a way to move to the future and be a little bit more pure about redefining what the party is. That can be difficult for a party as it's trying to seek the White House, but I think in that progressive lane, she's shown a lot, and she's distinguished herself. And distinguished herself even from Bernie Sanders. And I think every time, too, that Biden comes out and looks a little bit weaker, it gives more energy to others, including Elizabeth Warren.
On the subject of Joe Biden, there is this CNN exclusive interview that Chris Cuomo did with the former vice president and his wife, Jill Biden. And we have some new sound from overnight from that interview, Joe, where Jill Biden talks about what happened at the debate with Senator Kamala Harris. Listen to this.
The biggest surprise, I think, was the debate. I think, I think probably Kamala was a little bit of a surprise. He got into politics because of his commitment to civil rights. And then to be elected with Barack Obama, and then someone is saying, you're a racist. As soon as I heard those words...
Well, they say you're not a racist,
I know, but as soon as I heard those words, I thought, uh-oh, what's coming next? And I think the American people know Joe Biden. They know his values. They know what he stands for. And they didn't buy it.
Joe, have the Bidens successfully turned the page with this interview strategy before the next debate, which is on CNN in 3 weeks?
Well, I mean, I think the fact that they've done these interviews shows that they are concerned. But I think, Joe Biden's secret weapon is Dr. Jill Biden. She can talk about him in a way that he can't. I think there's some validity to the, when you start a sentence with, I don't think you're a racist, but, and I think, she did a good job there. I think, it's interesting, she says in there that, the American public knows who Joe Biden is. That's not necessarily true. And I think the value of these interviews is they get a much better sense, particularly when the two of them are talking. And when you look at his life story, it's a story of being tested and personal strength going through personal tragedy. So I think coming out of, a bad debate, they've done a pretty good job of trying to right the ship by going to their strength, which is his experience and his character.
But you'd think that somebody entering the third presidential race would not be so shocked by an incoming fire from, another Democrat. And both he and Jill Biden said that they were surprised by Kamala Harris coming after him. They should have been better prepared for that. And that's something that he's going to have to clearly anticipate going forward throughout this primary. I know he wants to focus on taking on President Trump, but this primary race is going to be a tough one for him as well.
David?
I think that's absolutely right. And I think that, and Joe makes a good point as well, which is, of course, people know Biden, but they don't know him as a potential number one. They know him more as a kind of, part of the political firmament in Washington and being a supporter and a supportive player as vice president to President Obama. But to know him as a front runner, to know him as a potential commander-in-chief, that is knowing a president differently. It clarifies the mind a little bit. And again, not being prepared to defend the record was something that I think was just a real gap.
All right, David, Joe, Bianna, thank you all very much. Jeffrey Epstein now faces charges in New York, but after his